On a sweltering February day in 1960, in the dusty border town of El Paso, Texas, Mercedes and Julian Ramirez welcomed their fifth child into the world. They named him Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez, later to become known as Richard Ramirez, a name that would strike terror into the hearts of Los Angeles residents and earn him the sinister moniker, the Night Stalker. No one could have predicted that this seemingly innocent baby would grow up to become one of America's most notorious serial killers, a predator who would stalk the night, leaving a trail of blood and terror in his wake. The Ramirez household was far from a nurturing environment. Julian Ramirez, a Mexican immigrant who worked for the Santa Fe Railway, was a violent and abusive man with a volcanic temper. The family lived in poverty in one of El Paso's rougher neighborhoods, where violence was as common as the desert heat. Julian's rage would explode without warning, and his children bore the brunt of his fury. Young Ricardo watched in terror as his father beat his siblings and screamed at his mother Mercedes, a devoutly religious woman who tried desperately to hold the family together. The house echoed with screams and the sound of fists meeting flesh. When his father's rage became too much to bear, little Ricardo would flee into the streets, wandering the dangerous neighborhoods of El Paso, already learning that the world was a cruel and violent place where only the strong survived. In 1965, when Ricardo was just 5 years old, fate dealt him a devastating blow that would alter the course of his life forever. While playing in his bedroom, a heavy dresser toppled over, striking him in the head with tremendous force. The impact caused a severe head injury, fracturing his skull and causing significant brain trauma. The family's poverty meant that proper medical care was out of reach. Ricardo was treated at a local hospital, but the full extent of the damage went undiagnosed and untreated. In the days and weeks following the accident, disturbing changes began to manifest. The once relatively normal child began experiencing severe epileptic seizures that would plague him for years to come. But the physical damage was only part of the story. Those who knew Ricardo before the accident noticed a marked change in his personality. The boy who had once shown flashes of normalcy became increasingly withdrawn, aggressive, and disturbing. Teachers reported bizarre behavior. He would stare blankly for long periods, then suddenly become violent without provocation. His seizures were often preceded by strange sensations and hallucinations that he couldn't explain or understand. Medical experts would later theorize that the head injury may have damaged the temporal lobe of his brain, an area associated with aggressive behavior and moral reasoning. Whether this injury was the catalyst for his later crimes or simply one factor among many remains a subject of debate, but there's no denying that the accident marked a turning point in young Ricardo's development. As Ricardo entered adolescence, struggling with his seizures and increasingly erratic behavior, a new and profoundly toxic influence entered his life. His older cousin Miguel, known as Mike, had recently returned from the Vietnam War, bringing with him the psychological scars and traumas of combat. Mike was a decorated soldier, but the war had changed him in ways that would prove catastrophic for his impressionable young cousin. Mike began spending considerable time with 12-year-old Ricardo, and what started as a mentorship quickly became something far more sinister. The Vietnam veteran regaled his young cousin with graphic tales of his experiences in Southeast Asia, stories of killing, torture, and sexual violence that he recounted with disturbing enthusiasm and pride. But Mike didn't just tell stories, he had proof. He showed Ricardo photographs from Vietnam, graphic images of dead and mutilated bodies, victims of his wartime activities. He described in vivid detail how he had killed enemy soldiers, how he had tortured prisoners, and most disturbing of all, how he had sexually assaulted and murdered Vietnamese women. To the traumatized and impressionable Ricardo, these weren't just war stories, they were lessons in power, control, and domination. Mike taught him that violence was not only acceptable but exciting, that causing pain and terror in others could be a source of pleasure and satisfaction. He introduced Ricardo to drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, further destabilizing the boy's already fragmented psyche. Under Mike's tutelage, Ricardo learned to use firearms, knives, and other weapons. More importantly, he absorbed a worldview that glorified violence and dehumanized victims. Mike's influence during these crucial formative years cannot be overstated. He was essentially grooming a future killer, filling his cousin's head with the tools and justifications for the horrors that would follow. On May 4, 1973, 13-year-old Ricardo was visiting Mike's apartment when the most traumatic event of his young life unfolded before his eyes. Mike had been arguing with his wife Jessie, their voices rising in anger throughout the evening. Ricardo, accustomed to family violence, initially paid little attention to the shouting from the next room. But this argument was different. Suddenly, the shouting stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. Then came the sound that would haunt Ricardo for the rest of his life, a single gunshot, sharp and final. Ricardo rushed to the bedroom to find Mike standing over Jesse's lifeless body, smoking gun still in his hand. Blood was spreading across the floor, and Jesse's eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. Mike looked at his young cousin with an expression that mixed satisfaction and cold indifference. "She got what she deserved," Mike said calmly, as if he had just swatted a fly. The sight of violent death, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the casual way Mike dismissed the life he had just taken, all of it seared itself into Ricardo's developing psyche. When police arrived and arrested Mike, Ricardo was left alone with the image of Jesse's corpse and the knowledge that violence could end a life in an instant. This moment crystallized everything Mike had been teaching him. Violence wasn't just something that happened in distant wars, it was immediate, powerful, and could be used to assert ultimate control over another human being. The line between fantasy and reality had been crossed, and there was no going back. Following Mike's arrest and imprisonment, Ricardo's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He was now a teenager, but his interests were far from normal. He spent hours in local cemeteries, fascinated by death and decay. He began torturing and killing small animals, starting with insects and gradually progressing to cats and dogs. The violence wasn't random, it was methodical, experimental, as if he was learning the mechanics of causing pain and death. At school, teachers and classmates began to fear him. He would sit in class with a vacant stare, then suddenly explode into violence over minor provocations. His academic performance plummeted, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was increasingly disconnected from normal social expectations and morality. His seizures continued to plague him, often preceded by strange sensations and hallucinations. Some who knew him described him as seeming to inhabit two different personalities, sometimes appearing almost normal, other times displaying a cold, predatory demeanor that made people instinctively uncomfortable. By age 16, Ricardo had dropped out of high school entirely. His family, overwhelmed by his behavior and their own struggles, seemed unable or unwilling to intervene effectively. He was increasingly drawn to the darkness, both literally and figuratively. He became nocturnal, sleeping during the day and roaming the streets at night, when he felt most comfortable and powerful. In 1982, at age 22, Ricardo made the decision that would prove fateful for countless innocent victims. He left El Paso behind and headed west to Los Angeles, drawn by the anonymity of the big city and the opportunities it might provide for someone with his particular interests and skills. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a city of contrasts. Glamorous Hollywood existed alongside dangerous urban decay, and the sprawling metropolitan area provided perfect hunting grounds for a predator who preferred to strike under cover of darkness. Ricardo, now calling himself Richard, found work in menial jobs but was far more interested in his nocturnal activities. He developed an extensive knowledge of the city's layout, studying maps and driving the streets at night, learning which neighborhoods were wealthy and poorly protected, which houses offered easy access, and how to move through the urban landscape without detection. He was methodical in his planning, understanding that success as a predator required careful preparation and intimate knowledge of the terrain. During this period, he also refined his appearance and persona. Gone was the awkward teenager from El Paso, in his place emerged a lean, dark figure who cultivated an aura of menace. He grew his hair long, developed a fascination with heavy metal music, particularly the band AC/DC, and adopted a style of dress that emphasized his intimidating presence. Richard's criminal career didn't begin with murder, it started with burglary. Throughout 1983 and early 1984, he honed his skills as a night prowler, breaking into homes while residents slept. Initially, he was content to steal valuables and money, but these early crimes served a more important purpose. They allowed him to perfect his methods of entry, to study sleeping victims, and to experience the intoxicating rush of power that came from having complete control over unsuspecting people. His preferred method was to find unlocked doors or windows. He became expert at moving silently through houses, navigating in near-total darkness, and identifying which rooms contained the most valuable items. But as time went on, the thrill of simple burglary began to fade. The excitement he sought required something more transgressive, more violent. It was during one of these early burglaries that Richard first crossed the line into sexual assault. Finding a sleeping woman alone in her bed, he was overwhelmed by the sense of absolute power over another human being. The assault itself was as much about dominance and control as it was about sexual gratification, themes that would become central to his later, more horrific crimes. The victim's terror, her helplessness, the way she begged for her life, all of it fed something dark and insatiable within Richard. He had found his true calling, and simple burglary would no longer be enough to satisfy his needs. On June 28, 1984, Richard Ramirez committed his first confirmed murder, though the crime wouldn't be connected to him for months. The victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, an elderly woman living alone in a ground-floor apartment in Glassell Park. Richard entered through an unlocked window, sexually assaulted her, and then cut her throat with a hunting knife so savagely that she was nearly decapitated. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. The level of violence seemed excessive, almost ritualistic. But what truly disturbed investigators was the apparent randomness of the attack. There seemed to be no connection between the killer and victim, no obvious motive beyond the act of violence itself. For Richard, the murder represented a milestone. He had crossed the ultimate threshold, taken a human life, and experienced a rush of power unlike anything he had felt before. The elderly woman's terror in her final moments, her complete helplessness, the way life had drained from her eyes, all of it intoxicated him and left him craving more. But Jenny Vincow's murder was just the beginning. Over the following months, Richard would develop the methodology and rituals that would define his reign of terror. He studied police procedures, learned from near misses, and refined his approach to maximize both his chances of success and the psychological impact on his victims. The true Night Stalker killing spree began in earnest in March 1985, when Richard's crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality. His victims were chosen seemingly at random: elderly couples, young families, single women, children. No one was safe from his predatory attention. The only common thread was that they were vulnerable and unlucky enough to cross paths with a killer at the height of his bloodlust. The Zazzera murders on March 27, 1985, established the template for many of Richard's subsequent crimes. Vincent Zazzera, 64, and his wife Maxine, 44, were sleeping in their Whittier home when Richard broke in through an unlocked door. He shot Vincent in the head as he slept, then turned his attention to Maxine. What followed was a prolonged ordeal of sexual assault, torture, and mutilation that culminated in her murder. Richard carved out her eyes with a hunting knife, a grotesque signature that would appear in several subsequent crimes. The sheer savagery of the attack left investigators struggling to understand what kind of person could commit such acts. The methodical nature of the violence, combined with its apparent randomness, created a sense of helplessness among both law enforcement and the general public. If such horrors could befall a middle-class couple in their own bedroom, no one was truly safe. But Richard was just getting started. Throughout the spring and summer of 1985, his attacks came with increasing frequency. The methods varied: sometimes he used firearms, other times knives or blunt instruments. Some victims were killed quickly, others tortured for hours before death finally released them from their suffering. The Doy family attack on May 14, 1985, demonstrated Richard's complete disregard for age or innocence. After shooting 66-year-old William Doy in the face, Richard brutally assaulted Doy's disabled wife Lillian, who had been sleeping next to her husband when the attack began. The randomness and cruelty of the assault left investigators and the public alike struggling to comprehend the mind behind such acts. What made Richard Ramirez particularly terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the psychological warfare he waged against his victims and the broader community. He seemed to understand instinctively that the anticipation of violence could be as powerful as violence itself. Before killing his victims, Richard often forced them to endure prolonged periods of terror. He would wake them from sleep, sometimes by shining a flashlight in their faces, and then reveal himself as their worst nightmare made flesh. His appearance alone was frightening, the long black hair, the rotting teeth, a result of poor hygiene and drug use, and the cold, predatory eyes that seemed to look right through his victims' humanity. He would often demand that victims swear their love for Satan, forcing them to participate in what he saw as blasphemous rituals before ending their lives. This wasn't just sadism, it was a calculated attempt to destroy not just their bodies but their spirits, to make their final moments as traumatic and degrading as possible. The sexual component of his crimes wasn't simply about gratification, it was about ultimate domination and control. Richard understood that sexual assault represented a form of violence that destroyed victims on multiple levels, attacking not just their physical being but their sense of safety, autonomy, and human dignity. His treatment of children was particularly disturbing. In several attacks, he forced children to watch as he assaulted and murdered their parents, understanding that such trauma would leave psychological scars that might never heal. The message was clear: no one was beyond his reach, no innocence too pure to be corrupted by his presence. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was a city gripped by fear. The media had dubbed the unknown killer, the Night Stalker, and his crimes dominated headlines across Southern California. Hardware stores reported runs on locks, security systems, and weapons as residents desperately tried to protect themselves from an attacker who seemed capable of striking anywhere, anytime. The randomness of the attacks was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the whole ordeal. Richard's victims came from all walks of life, wealthy and poor, young and old, different ethnic backgrounds and neighborhoods. There was no profile that could help people determine if they were at risk, because everyone was at risk. Sleep became elusive for many residents. The knowledge that the Night Stalker preferred to attack people in their beds, in what should have been their safest space, transformed bedrooms into places of anxiety and fear. Sales of sleeping pills plummeted as people were afraid to fall into the deep sleep that might prevent them from hearing an intruder. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Children were afraid to sleep alone, elderly residents barricaded themselves in their homes, and even young, healthy adults found themselves jumping at every unexpected sound. The Night Stalker had succeeded in terrorizing an entire metropolitan area, creating a climate of fear that affected millions of people. As the body count mounted, law enforcement agencies across Southern California coordinated their efforts in an unprecedented manhunt. The task force investigating the Night Stalker crimes included detectives from multiple jurisdictions, FBI profilers, and forensic experts from across the country. The investigation was hampered by several factors. Richard was careful to vary his methods and locations, making it difficult to establish clear patterns. He left few physical clues at crime scenes, and those he did leave often led nowhere. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, and many of the forensic tools that modern investigators take for granted simply didn't exist. What investigators did have was a growing collection of witness descriptions that began to paint a picture of their quarry. Survivors and witnesses described a tall, thin Hispanic man with long dark hair and severe dental problems. His teeth, in particular, became a crucial identifying feature. Multiple witnesses noted that his teeth were severely discolored and decayed, with several missing entirely. Ballistics evidence linked several of the shootings, confirming that the same weapon had been used in multiple attacks. This helped establish that the crimes were connected, but it didn't bring investigators any closer to identifying the shooter. The breakthrough would eventually come from an unexpected source, not high-tech forensics or brilliant detective work, but from old-fashioned police work and a stroke of luck that finally put a name to the face that had haunted Los Angeles for months. As summer turned to fall in 1985, Richard's crimes continued with unabated fury. The Bell Lang murders on August 8 demonstrated that his capacity for violence was not diminishing but rather intensifying. Ilyas Abuwath, 35, was shot in the head while sleeping next to his wife Sakina. Richard then spent hours torturing and sexually assaulting Sakina before finally killing her as well. But Richard was becoming careless, perhaps overconfident in his ability to evade capture. On August 24, 1985, he attacked the Mission Viejo home of Bill Carnes and his fiancée Inez Erickson. After shooting Carnes in the head and assaulting Erickson, Richard made a crucial mistake. He left behind clear fingerprints on a stolen car he had used to reach the crime scene. The car had been stolen in the Chinatown area of Los Angeles, and when police processed it for evidence, they found clear prints on the rearview mirror. These prints were run through the California Department of Justice database, and for the first time in the investigation, they got a hit. The prints belonged to Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, also known as Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a criminal record dating back to his teenage years. Suddenly, the faceless night stalker had an identity, a history, and most importantly for investigators, a set of associates and haunts where he might be found. On August 30, 1985, police released Richard Ramirez's mugshot to the media, and for the first time, the public could see the face of the monster who had terrorized them for so long. The photograph showed a lean man with long, stringy black hair, hollow cheeks, and cold, dead eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera lens. But it was his smile that people remembered most, a grotesque grin that revealed severely decayed and missing teeth, giving him an almost supernatural appearance of evil. The image was immediately recognizable to anyone who had seen it, and within hours of its release, tips began pouring in from across the region. Richard, unaware that his identity had been discovered, was in Arizona visiting family when his photograph appeared on television screens across the Southwest. He had made the trip believing he was still anonymous, still safe from detection. The reality of his situation hit him when he saw his own face staring back at him from a newspaper at a convenience store. In a panic, he attempted to steal a car to flee back to Los Angeles, but the vehicle's owner fought back, and Richard was forced to abandon his escape attempt. With law enforcement agencies across multiple states now searching for him, he made the fateful decision to return to Los Angeles, perhaps believing he could disappear into the urban landscape he knew so well. Richard's return to Los Angeles on August 31, 1985, set the stage for a dramatic conclusion to his reign of terror. Unaware of just how widely his photograph had been circulated, he made his way to the predominantly Hispanic neighborhood of East Los Angeles, where he hoped to blend in among people who looked like him. But his distinctive appearance, particularly his horrible dental condition, made him instantly recognizable to residents who had been studying his photograph in newspapers and on television for days. As he walked through the neighborhood, people began to point and whisper. The recognition spread like wildfire through the community. Richard, sensing danger, attempted to steal a car from a woman named Angelina de la Torre. But when she screamed, neighbors came running, and Richard found himself surrounded by an angry crowd of residents who had been living in fear of him for months. These were people whose community had been terrorized, whose neighbors and family members had been victimized, and they were not inclined to show mercy to the man responsible. The crowd grew larger and more aggressive as word spread that the night stalker had been cornered. Richard was beaten with metal pipes, kicked, and pummeled by dozens of people before police finally arrived to take him into custody. In a sense, it was poetic justice. The man who had terrorized individuals in the privacy of their homes was brought down by a community acting together in broad daylight. Richard Ramirez's trial began in 1988, nearly 3 years after his capture. The proceedings were a media circus, with Richard often appearing in court wearing sunglasses and displaying a pentagram carved into his palm, a symbol he claimed represented his allegiance to Satan. His behavior in court was designed to shock and intimidate, but it only served to reinforce the public's perception of him as a remorseless monster. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Fingerprint evidence, ballistics matches, eyewitness testimony, and survivor identifications all pointed to his guilt in multiple murders, sexual assaults, and burglaries. The prosecution methodically built their case, connecting Richard to crime after crime through forensic evidence and witness testimony. Richard showed no remorse throughout the trial. He often smiled at survivors who testified against him, made obscene gestures to the families of victims, and generally conducted himself in a manner designed to cause maximum pain to those who had already suffered so much at his hands. On September 20, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death for his crimes. As the sentence was read, he showed no emotion, maintaining the cold, predatory demeanor that had characterized his entire adult life. In a final act of defiance, he told reporters, "I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in us all." Richard Ramirez spent over 2 decades on California's death row, his case slowly working its way through the appeals process. During his incarceration, he received thousands of letters from admirers, many of them women who were inexplicably attracted to his notoriety and the dark charisma he projected even from behind bars. He married one of these admirers, Doreen Leoie, in 1996, in a ceremony conducted at San Quentin State Prison. The marriage was a media sensation, highlighting the disturbing phenomenon of hybristophilia, the attraction some individuals feel toward people who have committed serious crimes. Throughout his time on death row, Richard maintained his innocence in some crimes while remaining defiant about his overall guilt. He gave few interviews, but when he did speak, he showed no remorse for his actions and no sympathy for his victims or their families. He remained, until the end, exactly what he had always been, a predator without conscience or humanity. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications from B-cell lymphoma while still on death row at Marin General Hospital. He was 53 years old and had been awaiting execution for nearly 24 years. His death brought a sense of closure to some, though many victims' families expressed disappointment that he had not been executed for his crimes. The Night Stalker's death marked the end of one of the most terrifying criminal careers in American history. Over the course of just over a year, he had murdered at least 13 people, sexually assaulted dozens more, and terrorized millions of residents across Southern California. The psychological scars he left behind extended far beyond his immediate victims to include their families, their communities, and anyone who lived through that period of fear and uncertainty. The Richard Ramirez case remains a subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals trying to understand how a person becomes capable of such extreme evil. His story encompasses many of the risk factors that experts have identified as potentially contributing to violent criminal behavior: childhood trauma, head injury, exposure to violence, substance abuse, and social isolation. Yet for all the analysis and theorizing, Richard Ramirez ultimately remains something of an enigma. Thousands of people experience similar risk factors without becoming serial killers. The precise combination of nature and nurture that created the Night Stalker may never be fully understood, serving as a reminder that some forms of human evil resist simple explanation or categorization. His crimes also highlighted important changes in how law enforcement approaches serial crime investigations. The multi-jurisdictional task force approach pioneered during the Night Stalker investigation became a model for future cases, and advances in forensic science have made it much more difficult for killers to remain anonymous across multiple crime scenes. Perhaps most importantly, the Richard Ramirez case serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within the human species. In an age when we often seek to explain away criminal behavior through psychology and sociology, the Night Stalker represents pure malevolence, a person who chose to embrace darkness and inflict suffering for his own gratification, regardless of the cost to others. The shadows that Richard Ramirez cast over Los Angeles in 1985 have long since lifted, but the memory of his crimes continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the monsters that walk among us and the vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon them. In the end, he was brought down not by sophisticated police work or advanced technology, but by a community that refused to live in fear and chose to stand together against evil. The Night Stalker is gone, but his story remains, a dark chapter in the history of American crime that reminds us that evil is real, that monsters exist, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance against those who would use the cover of darkness to prey upon the innocent.